Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Why Do Some Teams Clash While Others Collaborate? My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager for the Myers-Briggs Company. So for those of you who don't know us so well, we're the Myers. As an organization, we have always challenged ourselves to look at how we can have an impact on people's lives through a greater understanding of themselves and others. Our passion really is people. And now I'm happy to introduce our speaker. So today we have John Haxton running the webinar. He lives and breathes the MBTI framework, and you may have seen other presentations by him, and you might even have seen his name quoted in a number of articles in the press. So welcome, John, and I will hand it over to you.
So thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you very much for that introduction. Now, as Caitlin has already said, the title of this webinar is Why Do Some Teams Clash While Others Collaborate? But before I try to answer that question, I'm going to ask you a different question. I'm going to ask you whether you're part of a team. So I'm going to launch a poll. You should in a moment see that appear. You can choose yes, you're a member of more than one team, or yes, I'm just a member of one team, or no, I'm not a member of a team. So let me just give you a couple of moments to answer that poll. Okay, so about nearly 2/3 of you have voted. Let me give you a little while longer to place your bets, place your votes. Okay, so over 3/4 of you have voted now. So far, it looks as if 80% of you are members of more than one team, 20% of one team, and nobody at all is a member of no teams at all. So it looks as if all of you are part of at least one, and actually 81% of you part of more than one team. So teams are important. So here's another question for you, not a poll this time, just something for you to think about. Have you ever thought that life would be perhaps so much easier, so much simpler, just less hard work if everyone was just a little bit more like you? It's certainly something that's gone through my mind from time to time. Now, of course, in practice, this sort of team might just have just a few drawbacks. So this group of people that you can see on the screen, despite the undoubted brilliance of each individual person, they may not actually perform so well together as a team. Certainly, it wouldn't be an ideal team, even if just occasionally, in a bad moment, I wonder if it might be. Each of us has our own particular strengths, but each of us also has our weaknesses, our blind spots. If everybody in a team was the same, those black holes in our awareness would get more and more obvious and cause more and more problems. So in theory, you'd expect more diverse teams to perform better than less diverse, more homogeneous ones. In a more diverse team, the people in that team can compensate for each other's weak spots and make the most of everyone's strengths. So that's the theory at any rate, but what about the practice? Well, research evidence suggests that in most situations, more diverse teams do indeed perform better. Here's where more diverse teams tend to perform better than less diverse, more homogeneous teams. Diverse teams are likely better in situations where an element of innovation or creativity is needed, where new areas need to be explored, where perhaps new processes are needed. Where the tasks that the team undertakes don't just require very straightforward responses, require more complex responses, where there's at least some, perhaps more, uncertainty and ambiguity around situations, and when things are in a state of flux, when things are changing. Now, it has to be said that there are some places, some situations, where actually less diverse, more homogeneous teams actually perform better. Perhaps where the team is implementing systems and processes which are already known, and there's not a lot of change around, where the tasks the team are doing only require very simple responses, and where there's very little, if any, uncertainty and ambiguity is around, where things are staying the same, where things are in a steady state. But a question I'd like to ask you is, which is your team environment? Which actually, I beg your pardon, I've just shown the wrong poll there. My apologies. Which situation more resembles the sort of situation that you find yourselves in? Are you in a situation where things are changing, perhaps things are sometimes ambiguous or uncertain, or in a situation where things aren't changing much at all? There's no little ambiguity, things are always steady. So, and straightforward. So let me just give you a moment to answer that question. Okay, so nearly 3/4 of you voted. Let me just give you a teeny little bit longer. And I'm going to close the poll now. And this time I will remember to share it properly with you. My apologies for earlier. So it looks like nearly all of you are in a situation where things are changing, where things are sometimes ambiguous or uncertain, where things can be complex. And what that suggests, and what all the research evidence suggests, is for those of you in that situation, very much it's diverse teams which are likely to deliver results for you. So in most of the situations that we face today, and in the situations that most of you are facing, diverse teams are likely to perform better than less diverse teams. But that doesn't, I'm very much afraid, mean that everything is going to be plain sailing. So for example, diverse teams tend to take longer to make decisions. In a more homogeneous team, everyone tends to think in the same way. There's no disagreement, so decisions are quick, but they can also be one-sided and subject to groupthink. In a more diverse team, there'll be different viewpoints, different ideas, different opinions, and all of these need to be gone through if members of the team aren't to feel shortchanged or disengaged. But the final result has a much better chance of being a more rounded decision, a much better decision. But of course, because there are all these different views and approaches, this can lead to conflict in the team. Some diverse teams will clash, but others do seem to be able to cooperate. So it's really important that people can understand where other members of the team are coming from, how to communicate with them, and how to either avoid conflict or use that conflict in a more productive, in a more useful way. And a key way to understanding that is to understand something about personality. Because research shows that the mix of personalities in a team does have a real effect on the team's performance. And two aspects of personality seem to be particularly important here: extroversion and introversion, and judging and perceiving. Generally, teams with a mix of extroverts and introverts, all things being equal, seem to generally perform better, whereas teams with a mix of judging and perceiving personality types tend to perform less well. So let's look at what this means. Let's look at what we mean by extroversion, introversion, and judging and perceiving, and what the implications of that are for people working with and in teams. Now, these aspects of personality form part of the MBTI framework, the Myers-Briggs type indicator framework. But before I start going through this in detail, let's just take a moment to see how familiar all of you are already with the MBTI approach. So I'm going to launch another poll which asks you about your knowledge of, your relationship with the MBTI framework. Perhaps you're an MBTI practitioner and use the questionnaire often. Perhaps you're qualified to use the MBTI, you're certified, but haven't used the instrument recently. Perhaps you've received MBTI feedback yourself, but have not been trained to use the questionnaire. It may be that you've heard of the MBTI, but have not completed it. And for some of you, the answer will be, what on earth is the MBTI? So let me just give you a little while to answer that poll, I see nearly 2/3 of you answered. Let's wait till 3/4 of you answered the poll. Let's give you a little while longer. Okay, and I'm going to stop the voting in just a moment. And let's close there and share the results. So a fifth of you, 20%, are saying, what's the MBTI? Another 11% have heard of the MBTI. 34%, just over a third, have received feedback. So the majority of you aren't actually trained to use the MBTI, but some of you have a little bit of experience of it. So what I'm going to do now, with my apologies to the 14% of you who are a practitioner and do use it often, and the 20% who are qualified but perhaps haven't used it for a while, I'm just going to take a moment to go through what the MBTI, what the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator framework actually looks at. So as you can see perhaps on the screen at the moment, it looks at its base at 4 aspects of personality. First of all, it looks at what's called extroversion and introversion. And this is all about where you get your energy from. People with a preference for extroversion prefer to get their energy from the outside world of people and things, and that's also where they tend to focus their attention. People with a preference for introversion prefer to get their energy from their inner world of thoughts and feelings, and that's also where they prefer to focus their attention, on that inner world. Now you'll notice I'm using the phrase prefer and preference here because the MBTI isn't about your abilities or skill, it's about the way you prefer to live your life. Do you prefer to focus on the outside world for extroversion? Do you prefer to focus on the inside world for introversion? And we all have a preference in one direction or the other. The next area is called sensing and intuition, and that's about the sort of information that you prefer to use. People with a preference for sensing prefer to use and rely on information which is real, which is actual, which is solid, which comes from the evidence of their 5 senses, or their very clear memories of their memories that come from their 5 senses. Things which are practical, things which are in the real world. Whereas on the intuitive side, people with that preference prefer to rely on information which is more about how things combine together, what the possibilities are, what could be, what's heading towards the future, connections. Thinking and feeling is about the way you prefer to make decisions. People with a thinking preference prefer to make decisions on the basis of objective logic. People with a feeling preference prefer to make decisions in terms of how those decisions will affect people and how those decisions relate to their values. And lastly, judging and perceiving is all about how you deal with the outside world, the world around you. Do you prefer to live your life in an organized, structured, planned way, in which case you have a preference for judging? Or do you prefer to live your life in a more open-ended, spontaneous, unplanned way, in which case you have a preference for perceiving? So any one person will have a preference for extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. So if you look at the possible combinations, that means there are 16 possible personality types that might relate to an individual's particular personality preference. So for example, if someone has a preference for introversion, for sensing, for thinking, and for judging, we say their overall preferences were for ISTJ, the responsible realist, which you can see towards the top left of that type table at the right-hand side. Again, my apologies to those of you who know the MBTI back to front, but hopefully for others that was useful information or useful refresher. Now, on the previous slide, we talked about the idea that teams with a mix of extroversion and introversion tend to perform well, but that teams with a mix of judging and perceiving tend to perform less well. Let's see why that might be the case. First of all, let's look at extroversion and introversion. Now, to introverts, extroverts can seem loud, can seem brash, can seem overbearing even. In a meeting, extroverts sometimes seem to be vying for attention with each other. They're often happy to talk over each other, and maybe everyone's talking at once. And this isn't, as far as the extrovert is concerned, it's not about being rude or about cutting people off. It's just that if things come into your head, you say those things out loud because talking things through as an extrovert is what you do. So to introverts, a lot of what extroverts say may seem inconsequential, not thought through, while introverts can have sometimes difficulty getting a word in edgeways in a meeting involving a largely extrovert team. And to extroverts, introverts may seem too quiet, too disengaged. They may wonder, why aren't these people just saying what they think? Introverts don't always respond quickly to questions because they are thinking things through to give the best answer. But as far as the extrovert is concerned, especially if they haven't thought of this stuff before, they're thinking maybe they're not interested in what I'm saying, or perhaps maybe they're just not very clever. But actually, these are all misapprehensions. And introverts and extroverts can work together really well once they know where the other person is coming from. Introverts can make use of and appreciate the energy and the orientation to do things and take action that extroverts tend to bring. Extroverts can learn that when introverts say something, it's usually the end point of a long train of thought, so that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, this would be a really worthwhile contribution and shouldn't be ignored. And sometimes, indeed, the right thing to do is to pause before rushing into a decision. Last month, for example, we presented a webinar that goes into a lot more detail about extroversion and especially introversion, and we can send you a link to that after this session. So whatever our natural preference for extroversion or for introversion, we can learn to work together with our opposite. And tools like the MBTI can really help with this by raising your self-awareness and give you a framework for first understanding yourself, then understanding how you and other people differ from each other, and then understanding others and understanding how best to work with them. Now, when it comes to extroversion and introversion, we already know that diverse teams, in terms of extroversion and introversion, generally perform well. But certainly an understanding of type can help further. And perhaps this shouldn't be so surprising. Whether we behave in an extroverted or an introverted way is one of the more obvious things about us as human beings. It's something that most people, certainly not everybody, but most people are more or less aware of. But when it comes to judging and perceiving, things are a little different. And we know that teams that are more diverse in this aspect of personality often perform less well, especially when people are not aware of this aspect of the human psyche. So judging and perceiving, if you recall, is all about how we prefer to live our lives. Giving the chance, would you rather live your life in a fairly ordered, structured way, where you've planned things in advance, you know what's coming up, you know what's going to happen. That's the judging approach. Or would you rather live in a more open, spontaneous way, where you can do things as and when it seems right, you don't have to stick to plans or stick to a schedule? Now, both are equally valid ways to live our lives, equally valid ways to be, but when judging and perceiving people have to work together in a team, things sometimes don't go so well. Judging people can see perceiving people as disorganized. Because the perceiving person may not start a job as soon as the judging person would, or be talking about and showing a clear and obvious plan, they worry that things won't get done on time, and they might just try to set artificial deadlines or to micromanage the perceiving person. And that tends not to go down so well. And perhaps in the picture on the slide, you can see an example of where that's not working quite so well. Perceiving people can see judging people as inflexible, with rigid plans that mean they're not able to change tack when circumstances change. and as people who are wanting to make decisions and move on before there's been time to really appreciate the situation. But just like for extroversion and introversion, judging and perceiving people can work together very well once they understand these aspects of their personality. Those with a judging preference can help make sure that things do get done on time. Those with a perceiving preference can bring flexibility when conditions change and stop things being shut down too soon. But knowledge of judging and perceiving is less known about than knowledge of extroversion introversion, and there's more room for people who haven't been through tools like the Myers-Briggs type indicator to think that the other person is doing things just to annoy you, just to pee you off. So knowing yourself and knowing how you fit into a team, understanding how other people in the team operate, that's the key to turning a dysfunctional team into a functioning, productive team. And tools like the MBTI assessment give you a way to gain and leverage that knowledge. In a research project a little while ago, we asked people where it was at work that increasing their self-awareness had been most helpful. And they came up with all kinds of answers: coping with stress, dealing with change, working with clients. But the most frequent answer was working with others in a team. So we've talked perhaps a little bit about the big picture of why understanding other people's personality in a team can be really useful. But let's go on now to look at perhaps some practicalities. Let's look at just how you might go about using the MBTI framework to help people, to help you, to help your team, your clients, just to help people in general work better with others in a team. And all of the areas I'm going to talk about, all the insights which hopefully I'll share, are available directly to managers and team leaders with a new Teams functionality in the MBTI online system. And Caitlin will talk about these a little bit later. Or to train MBTI practitioners through the MBTI team report. Now, we said earlier that the combination of extroversion, introversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving means that there are 16 possible types. And here they are, laid out in a format that's usually called a type table. Any team is going to be made up from a selection of types from around this table. So, for example, this team might include one person with preferences for ENTP, extroversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. Now, knowing someone's type won't tell you everything about a person's behavior, but it's likely to tell you quite a lot. So, for example, these are the sort of strengths that someone with ENTP preferences can typically bring to a team. Things like identifying new opportunities and possibilities, analysing problems logically and objectively, bringing perhaps a more entrepreneurial spirit to the team, and so on. But the extent to which they're able to do these things, the extent to which they're able to use these strengths in the team will depend on the context, and that very much includes the personality preferences of the other people in the team, and indeed of the team as a whole. So let's look at the rest of this example team. As well as our ENTP individual, this particular team includes two people with ISTJ preferences, one with ESTJ preferences, and one with preferences for ENTJ. So 5 people in all. And if we look at the types of the team overall, we'll see that there are more people with an extroversion than an introversion preference, so perhaps an extroversion preference predominating in this particular team. More people with a sensing than an intuitive preference, so 3 of a sensing preference, 2 of an intuitive preference. No one at all with a feeling preference. Everyone in this particular team has a thinking preference. and definitely more people with a judging preference for people than with a perceiving preference, just one person. So overall then, this is an ESTJ kind of team. The words that you can see written in the blue border around the figure and the picture on the right-hand side, assertive, decisive, and so on, these will tend to describe the overall character of this particular team. And that means that as a team, this will potentially have a lot of strengths. They'll tend to act quite quickly, make quick decisions and act them quite quickly. Those decisions are going to be based typically on solid known facts. They're going to set clear, very tangible goals and have very clear expectations of the team members and of other people, and very much organize and plan so that they will meet those goals. Those goals will typically be focused on quite practical results, and they will very much push and drive others within the team and outside the team to achieve those results, to achieve those objectives. And when it comes to problem solving, they very much tend to analyze those problems logically and objectively. But the team may also have some blind spots, some possible weaknesses. They may have a tendency to make decisions very quickly, snap decisions, meaning they have to then redo work later. So for this team, a learning point might be, for example, to make sure that when it comes to an important decision, the team really sits down and spends time discussing all the facts, all the possibilities, so looking at the intuitive side of things as well, and all the implications of this decision, looking at feeling the implications for people, as well as the logically correct answer. They may have a tendency to reject new ideas as impractical before giving them a chance. So before they reject new ideas, they may want to think why. Are there actually any inconsistencies or flaws in this idea? How can we deal with those? What might be the best case scenario? They may fail to recognize trends or see the big picture, and they may be too focused on the short term. So again, for an important decision, it's useful for them to think about, okay, what would happen if the situation was the same in a year's time, or 3 years' time, or 5 years' time? What's likely to change between now and then and then? They may have a tendency to steamroller any obstacles, which may also mean steamrolling people. So they may want to think about how the team goals fit into the goals of other teams in the organization, or the larger organization, or the community as a whole. And they may have a tendency not to celebrate successes, which may not always work so well with everybody in a team. So these are perhaps a little bit general. They're generally the strengths and blind spots of the team. It might be useful also to think about particular applications. Some of the activities teams may typically get involved in, the stuff that teams do. And one thing that pretty much every team needs to do is to solve problems, to collect and process information and ideas, and then as a team, make a decision based on that information. And a really good way to do this is to use something called the Z model. If any of you are joining us from outside the United States, this in the UK and elsewhere is sometimes called the zigzag model. Now, we talked before about extroversion and introversion and about judging and deceiving, but the Z model uses the middle two aspects of personality, sensing and intuition, and thinking and feeling. In making a decision, in solving a problem, you first of all need to take in information and then make a decision based on information. Sensing and intuition relate to the different ways we might prefer to collect and use information, and thinking and feeling relate to how we prefer to make decisions. The idea behind the Z model is that in making a decision, we make sure that we use both sensing and intuition to gather the information, and then use both thinking and feeling to make the final decision. So you may, for example, start with sensing. What's real? What do we actually know? What are the facts? Perhaps, what can we learn from past experience? Then move on to intuition. Where are we heading? How does everything connect together? What really is the big picture here? Then take all that information, weigh up the pros and cons logically, and look to see what the objectively right answer might be. And finally, think about how that decision will impact on the people involved and how this relates to your own values and perhaps the team's values or the organization's values using feeling. Now, each of us has our own preferences when it comes to sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling. My own type preferences are for INTP. Introversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. So unless I stop and force myself, I'll tend to spend most of my time using intuition to think about possibilities and ideas, ignoring sensing issues like what does past experience tells us, what's actually realistic, and then go on to make a logical decision using thinking, ignoring feeling issues like how will this decision impact on other people, who else needs to be involved, how can I get buy-in, and so on. But now I've learned more about myself and through knowing more about my MBTI type, this has, I'm glad to say, become less of an issue for me. For an important decision, I can force myself to spend equal amounts of time on sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, asking myself relevant questions at each stage. And what goes for us as individuals and our individual problem solving also goes for team problem solving. In an ideal world, this is how the Z model might work in a team. The team might start by looking at the problem in a sensing way, looking at the facts, and what past experience can make the picture, which members of the team have experience of this issue, being realistic, and building outwards from what's already known, rather than taking a shot in the dark. But then also using intuition to look at possibilities and the big picture, at where things are heading, and at new ideas. Then taking all that information and using both thinking and feeling to come to a well-rounded, more complete, more well-founded decision. But of course, real teams don't usually have equal numbers of people with sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling preferences in them. Real teams will tend to spend rather more time on their favorite processes and rather less time on things that come less naturally to them. So, for example, how would this Z model work for the ISTJ team we looked at before? Well, the dominant type in this team is ESTJ. Only 2 of the 5 people have an intuitive preference, and no one at all had a feeling preference. So in team meetings and in team problem solving, there'll be more attention paid to the sensing side of things, on things like new possibilities, and the big picture might get sidelined. And very little or no attention at all might be paid to feeling. This team might neglect to involve other people who should have the same things, fail to involve stakeholders generally, ignore their values or the values of the organization, or ignore people considerations that may be important to others, either inside or outside the business. And also, this team could struggle to keep harmony within the team. In fact, there's a distinct possibility that the team would go straight from discussing a problem in a sensing way to making a decision using thinking, and then move to implement this barely using intuition and not using feeling at all, leading to what will really be unbalanced and less optimal solution to a problem, weighted in favor of sensing and thinking, missing out on the big picture and the people issues. And this is especially likely to happen when time is short or when members of a team are stressed, and that, unfortunately, is often when some really important decisions actually need to be made. But the good news is that once people know this stuff, what their approach to decision making is as individuals and as a team, they can compensate. For example, if they have an hour to meet and discuss an issue, they can force themselves to spend 15 minutes discussing it in a sensing way, 15 minutes discussing it from an intuitive perspective, 15 minutes discussing it with a logical answer, and 15 minutes taking people issues into account, spending equal amounts of time and equal amounts of energy on all 4 areas. Now, for all of these ideas, all of this information is available for the team and for the individual within the team once all the members of the team have completed the MBTI assessment. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at decision making, and that's because decision making and problem solving are really important in any team. When I've run team building sessions myself, the Z model is almost always something I'll use. And in a real life team, when we're able to go back to a physical room, you might, for example, have questions related to sensing, to intuition, to thinking and feeling relating to that particular problem, pin those up on the 4 walls of a room and ask people to spend equal amounts of time discussing those issues. But of course, as well as problem solving, decision making, there are often other things you might also want to look at with the team, and lots of these also relate to personality. Communication, for instance. If we were to sit in on a meeting of our ESTJ team, one of the first things you might notice is it could get quite loud. Over half the team have preferences for extroversion. There's likely to be quite a lot of discussion. People will be thinking out loud, talking over and interrupting each other. You may notice that the figure in the ESTJ graphic at the bottom right of this slide, that figure has a loudspeaker, and that's really quite deliberate. So in team meetings, it'll be important that the 2 people who prefer introversion are given a chance to speak. And then when they do, the other team members let them speak. They don't jump in and interrupt them or try to chivvy them along. Most of the people in this team have, as part of their personality, something called extroverted thinking. They want to organize the outside world, organize things around them, organize decisions in a logical way. That means that their communication is likely to be quite direct, quite no nonsense, to the point, might sometimes seem quite forceful, even perhaps at times a little bit aggressive, especially when they're stressed. So when they are communicating with others inside or outside the team, it might be a good idea for them just to stop, pause, review what we're about to say, or review what we're about to send. The sensing preference of this team overall means that they're going to be quite focused on facts and details. So if the intuitive members of a team start talking about less tangible ideas or the big picture, others in the team may see this as unrealistic and try to cut most people off. But often it's going to be really quite useful if they can resist this impulse in order to make sure new ideas are brought into the team and discussed. The team might, for example, ask those who prefer intuition if they can think of better ways to accomplish the team's goals, their immediate goals and their long-term goals. And this team is likely to want to move quite quickly to make a decision and move on, and might become irritable if the perceiving member of the team wants to explore more information ideas first, even if doing so actually would eventually make for a better decision, a better solution. The team might even sometimes ask the perceiving team member if there's any more information that needs to be considered before a decision is made, as something they may incorporate more generally into their meetings. And this group is likely to want to move quite systematically through any agendas, checking off topics as they go, which may mean that sometimes they're reluctant to return to the topics, but sometimes it may be useful for them to do so. So for each member of a team, with their individual personality types, there are going to be particular actions that they can take to help improve communication in a team. Here, for example, are some of the actions that the ENTP in our ESTJ team could take. Pardon me. And there will be different actions for each individual team member depending on their own type and the overall composition of the team. And by knowing the MBTI personality type, they might cause and what some source of conflict in the team might be generally, and modify their behavior so as to make conflict. So again, here are some possible actions for an ENTP individual in an ESTJ team. And if you compare this list with the previous list for communication, you'll see there's something of an overlap. The way that we communicate can either contribute to or alleviate or improve conflict within a team. Now, in the time we've had together, because we do want to leave some time for questions at the end, we've only really been able to perhaps begin to scratch the surface of how we could use personality to see how teams can collaborate rather than clash. Because personality really is the key to unlocking how teams behave and to help those teams perform at an optimal level. By building the self-awareness and understanding of their own personality of individual team members, they can then start to understand other people's personality, understand how they're different to some people, similar to others, and begin to understand what makes other people tick. And in a team, that means that they can both improve their relationships with individual team members, and there's some information you'll find on understanding one-to-one relationships and work with individual members of the team in terms of the MBTI Online Teams application, and also to understand the interactions of the team more generally and how the team will operate as a whole, so that they can begin to appreciate and work with the likely strengths of the team, think about how they're going to alleviate or account for some of the possible blind spots of the team, and how they might go about solving problems, communicating more effectively both inside and outside the team, and how they may begin to work with conflict. So, thank you for your time today. What I'm going to do now is to turn you back over to Caitlin, who are going to take you through some possible next steps and talk you through how you can access all of these insights we've talked through about teams for yourselves. And once we've done that, there'll be a chance to answer any questions that you have. So Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, John. So as John mentioned, you can go ahead and submit questions in the questions box if you have any now, and then we can get to those in just a second. But I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of where we have this information, some more spots where you can read a little bit more about it. And the first is really especially for our HR managers out there. So you or someone in your organization can learn how to administer our tools to assess these personality differences that John talked about. And that leads to obviously improved communication, reducing conflict, managing stress, and helping the teams in general function across the organization. So the second solution we have is the MBTI Insights Workshop, and this is a virtual live session, and it's a great way to bring the MBTI into a team with the help of our experts. And there's add-ons that focus on building resilience, managing change, and enhancing communication, and all of these are essential at the moment, especially. And lastly, if you're looking for a self-directed option with a quicker turnaround time, I just want to highlight MBTI Online Teams, which John also mentioned. So with MBTI Online Teams, your team gets individual insights as well as a team report that covers all of the key information that John reviewed. Each team member also gets individual courses as a bonus to dive deeper into communication, stress, confidence, getting along, and other topics. And everyone completes this training at their own pace. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the 3 options. And we have more resources, more information at this page, and we'll be sending this out in the follow-up, so you don't have to worry about trying to write it down. But we will jump into questions. So I do have a few for you, John. So the first question is, I think my coworker and I are both perceiving, but we still have conflicts. Why is that?
It's obviously we talked about judging and deceiving as one source of conflict in the team, but sadly it's probably true to say that there are as many sources of conflict as there are people. When we look at personality type in particular, that conflict can come from a number of places. Judging, deceiving is one that we often see, but it can come from areas of personality as well. So one of the other main sources of conflict is this idea of thinking or feeling. Are you preferring to make decisions on the basis of objective logic? Or are you preferring to make decisions on the basis of how your values will be affected, how they relate to your values, and how those decisions will affect people? And again, that can be a source of conflict because both the thinking person and the feeling person is both wanting to make the right decision, but they're coming at things from a very different point of view. If anybody wants an illustration of this, if you go onto YouTube and type in nail in the head MBTI, you can see a somewhat tongue-in-cheek but still I think interesting video which talks about this and gives an illustration of how that could come about. But even for judging and perceiving, if we look at perceiving, for example, people who have a preference for perceiving like to not do things till they need to be done, don't necessarily want to be the person who plans everything. And sometimes if you have 2 perceiving people working together and one of them is the person who always finds themselves having to do the planning, having the person who checks how things are going, because that's not their natural preference, that can really start to get to them. So it's important that people of the same type actually work out how they're going to work together as well. Thanks, Caitlin. Hope that answered the question.
Yeah. And okay, I have another one. So how does this apply to virtual teams? And I'm assuming that this kind of takes into account the fact that obviously the way we interact with each other is a little bit different now.
Yeah. The way of interacting with each other is a little bit different now, and realistically is going to be for some time to come. And we hear in the news every day that various well-known organisations are going entirely virtual, or don't know, reopening their physical offices for some time, or trying to go mainly virtual, etc. And increasingly in a multinational world, multinational teams very rarely get together. Even before COVID, very rarely got together face to face. I think this information is just as important, probably if anything more important, for virtual teams, because there's even more opportunity for communication, for example, to be misinterpreted. And you can see in some of the links that Caitlin's going to send you on our website some hints for communicating together in a virtual fashion. So I think this is even more important for a virtual world probably than it is for more traditional teams, which can get together and have the advantage of more obvious things like more obvious body language and how they're interpreting their relationships with each other. So again, tools like the MBTI and other tools can actually work really well in that context. Thanks,
Awesome.
Caitlin.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. So the last question is, what is the difference between MBTI Online and the Teams report that you showed?
Okay, thank you. So this really goes down to something that Caitlin was talking about before. Essentially, if you want to use this information, there's all this useful information, hopefully useful insights about using the MBTI in Teams. There's a couple of different routes you could go down. As we said, one route is to either get trained yourself or to work with someone who's already trained in using MBTI who can guide you through our process. And very often, in carrying out that work, they'll use the Teams report. And you saw a few pages of the Teams report as we went through the presentation. Alternatively, you can use the MBTI online system, which is more self-directed, as Caitlin mentioned, and you'll actually get hold of the team report as part of that system, but you'll be able to work through those training courses and things as well. So it's not that there's a difference between the two. The team report is something that's available to you from the MBTI online system, but also if you're working with a practitioner, really different routes to the same end, being able to use and apply these insights to help you work together better with others in a team, if you're in a team, as you all are, or for those of you who are managers or team leaders, to help your team work together more effectively. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah, and so I think that's gonna go ahead and wrap us up for those questions for today. So if there are any other questions, you can email us at any time and we can have John or one of our other experts create a response for you. So this was being recorded, so we'll be sending this out to you in the next few days, and you can also reply to that with any questions or requests for more information on anything. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and wish you a great rest of your week.